coronary valves and aortic valves haven't opened, and we have pressure increasing, it spikes very rapidly. All right, we'll look at that on Thursday. So to get into the aorta, it has to pass through the aortic semilunar valve. I'm putting semilunar in parentheses. I used to require it all the time, but it's become standard usage now to just say aortic valve. There's no other aortic valve. You can't say left valve because we have the left atrioventricular valve, all right? And you can't just say semilunar because we have two different semilunar valves, but aortic valve is okay. And then, that's going to be hard to see, but I'll draw it in here. And to move through the pulmonary trunk, we have the pulmonary valve. So what opens these valves? Pressure. So the same pressure that is closing the atrioventricular valves is opening the semilunar valves. And the reason we do that is because they're in opposite, the valve flaps or cusps are oriented in opposite directions. So ventricular pressure is going to push these leaflets together as the atrioventricular valves, and the semilunar valves are oriented in this direction, and so that same pressure is going to push them open. Okay? And so blood flow is now in either the pulmonary trunk or in the aorta and on its way. Just above the aortic valve, and we'll take another short break and come back and look at coronary circulation, are two openings for the vessels, the arteries that supply the heart. And these are the coronary arteries. See them right here. So semilunar valves always have three cusps or leaflets. They're kind of like a sconce. So when the heart relaxes, blood flows backwards from the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. As pressure in the ventricles is dropping, blood is not being pushed into the pulmonary trunk or the aorta as high a rate or force. And eventually, as the ventricle pressure drops below that pressure in the aorta, the valves are going to close. And the valves close because they fill with blood during that backflow. And that keeps blood from flowing completely back into the ventricles. When those cusps close, two openings become visible associated with two of those leaflets, and those are the openings for the coronary arteries. They're not valves of the coronary arteries, but these are just the opening of the coronary artery. So, when is the coronary artery going to get filled with blood? During ventricular contraction or ventricular relaxation? Relaxation. Okay? It makes sense. It seems like, well, wait a minute. You know, if you think about this, the only time when the heart is contracting, contracts and then it rests. Okay? And the heart's going to get blood supply when it rests. What happens to your heart rate when you exercise? It goes up. It takes just as long for the heart to contract. What gets shorter is the rest period. So while you're running and your heart rate is increased, you're actually getting less blood supply to the heart because you're getting a shorter rest period. Now blood pressure is increased, so that helps, all right? But you're still getting a shorter rest period and a shorter time that blood can flow into those coronary arteries. So if you have coronary artery disease, you're not going to get enough oxygen flow, ischemia, angina pectoris or chest pain result. Okay? Now, to illustrate that, Stephanie, if you could do the heart. So her hands are going to be the heart muscle. All right? My fingers are going to be coronary arteries sending their branches down. So I'm sending my branches down now. Blood's flowing through, the heart's relaxed. Now contract. squeeze your fingers. What's happening to the diameter of the coronary vessels? They're getting smaller. So it does make sense that blood's not flowing through those vessels when the heart's under contraction because they're going to be squeezed anyway. All right, so the heart relaxes, those blood vessels can open up, coronary arteries get uncovered, and now blood flows through. Okay? You can imagine if these were a little higher, okay, and blood would only flow through them when the heart was contracting, then the heart's squeezing those vessels and it wouldn't work as well. So you just have to make sure you have healthy vessels and adequate diameters to get blood to the heart tissue. All right, so notice how distinctly different the two half components of the heart are, the blue versus the red. All right? So deoxygenated blood is flowing into the right atrium, through the valves, into the right ventricle, and out the pulmonary trunk, all deoxygenated. When it comes back from the lungs, it's oxygenated. And it's going into the left side, to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and out the aorta. Before we take another short break, I want to connect you to one more fetal structure that allows the blood to not go to the lungs. If you look at your hearts, on the small hearts, there's a band of brown tissue here, a cord of tissue, all right? In the large heart, it's white, and it's between the pulmonary trunk and aorta, so it's number 13. These green things, by the way, are lymph nodes, which we won't cover. Yeah, so right here, you close the cover to the left atrium, is the ligamentum arteriosum. It's a connection between the left pulmonary artery and the aorta. It's closed, it's solid after the baby is born. It fills in with collagen fibers. But before the baby is born, it's open. It's a channel, the short blood vessel or duct. And as blood is flowing to the lungs, which are under higher resistance, some of that blood will bypass and go into the aorta because it's already oxygenated and go on to the body. Okay? So this tissue is this structure right here, known as the ligamentum arteriosum, post-fetal life. We'll give it a ductus arteriosus. We'll talk about that when we get back to fetal circulation at the end of veins. So let's take a break until 1:15. Come back and talk about the coronary blood vessels, and the rest of the time will be lab. It'll take about 15 minutes to do that, okay? Just want to give you a chance to break and stretch.
So the ligamentum arteriosum is essentially just a bypass when it's still developing.
When it was open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
Because the blood already has oxygen, it's just going to be wasted to go to the lungs. It doesn't need all the blood.
okay, so just so I understand the pathway correctly, deoxygenated comes in from the top, the bottom, and then passes.
And the heart itself.
I always remember the coronary sinus. Where does the blood from the coronary sinus originate?
That's what we'll cover when we come back. It's the blood that was in the heart. So the capillaries come back together to form veins, pass up through the myocardium, and are found on the surface of the heart, forming veins on the surface of the heart. And so these veins come together, wrap around to the back, and form the coronary sinus.
So it's basically
It's like a whole bunch of
internal
rivers flowing
recirculation.
into a lake.
Okay. And then, so we have these series of one-way valves. I forgot what they were called.
Atrioventricular, so between
Oh, yes,
the
that's
atrium
right.
and the ventricle.
And those are connected by the
Chordae?
Chordae.
Cord. Tendinous cord.
to those papillary muscles.
Correct.
And those are acting essentially as one-way valves, is like you would see in like a tube of blood. You can only pass that one way.
Exactly.
So as it's, let's see, I'm guessing as it's expanding, it's taking the blood in,
at rest. So when the heart is at rest, pressure is going to push blood into the atria, and these are already open. That pressure pushes it open. The ventricles are not a fixed wall, so they will expand as more blood flows in. They will just keep expanding until the atria, this is what we'll cover on Thursday next week, the atria will finally contract and squeeze a little bit more in, and then the ventricles will contract.
And that's what pushes everything out the pulmonary artery.
So, but before it goes out, the pressure is not quite yet strong enough to open when these start to contract. So as the pressure increases, it's first going to close these valves, and then right, and now we have a completely closed chamber because both sets of valves are closed. Pressure rises really fast and pushes these valves open.
And as a consequence of that, we also get blood flowing through the coronary artery as well.
When the heart is at rest, not when the valves are open.
Okay. Yeah.
So now the ventricles contract, blood is pushed through the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. That's called ejection. And then the ventricles relax. The atria have already been relaxed, and blood is continuing to flow into the atria while they're relaxed. As soon as the ventricles relax enough so that this pressure is less than this pressure, that's going to push those valves open. And these valves will actually close first, and blood will flow through the coronary arteries. Pressure will continue to drop, these valves will open, and the same thing starts all over again as all this blood dumps back into the ventricles.
That is amazing. I was impressed with the brain. This is just astounding.
And the fact that it is not controlled by nerves. You can cut the heart out and put it in a beaker for a frog heart, put it in a beaker of salt solution, and it will beat for 45 minutes. So it uses up all its ATP.
Now, there was one thing I missed.
Okay.
When we were talking about the pulmonary trunk and the split, the division and the different type of blood, could you explain that to me real quick?
I'm not sure what you mean by different type of blood.
It sounded like
pulmonary arteries. So I was saying it's called an artery even though it's carrying deoxygenated blood because it's under high pressure and going away from the heart. So we call arteries or veins, we call blood vessels arteries or veins based on the pressure that they're under and the direction that the blood is. And the pressure is based on the direction the blood is going. So the closer it is to the heart, the higher the pressure.
So I just misunderstood that. I understood
you got that part, so I wasn't saying anything different.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah,
okay.
It just threw me for a second because I was trying to do the drawing at the same time, and I thought I missed something really important.
Same thing as I said previously with the pulmonary vein system. I told you this would be a little bit better.
This makes sense to me. This makes crystal clear sense.
Good.
The physics of it really makes sense.
And that will be good, because one of the most confusing parts, for some reason, is that cardiac cycle and what causes what valves to open when and whatever. And it's that pure pressure relationship.
Now, did I hear you correctly earlier that you mentioned you had a video documenting the pathway of one blood vessel or some blood flow entirely?
What I was going to say was, in lab, I will take you through one red blood cell at a time to go through it. When in actuality, as we just talked about, the heart contracts, the heart's at rest, the two atria contract, and then the two ventricles contract, and then they both relax. It's this constant. But when we follow a single blood cell, it's through a single chamber at a time, obviously. And the heart doesn't contract, first one chamber, then the next, then the next, then the next. So it's top and bottom together. So that's the actual cardiac cycle, but to follow a single drop or a single red blood cell, that's what's in your lecture notes on one of the pages. I'll do it to you in lab. We have to go chamber by chamber. And that we'll go through the heart that way just to make sure everybody's seeing.
But in actuality, there's basically the two halves are operating in tandem.
Top and bottom together, not right and left.
Yeah, oh, I get that.
Good.
Yeah, that makes crystal clear sense. The reason I asked, I was just curious, like, if I'm going to search for it when I get home, but I'm wondering if someone has, I guess they would do it with CG, like graphics, but a representation, like a sagittal section of the heart, or actually, I guess you would call it, you would call it sagittal, but documenting the whole pathway.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you could. In fact, I have.
That would be amazing.
I have one for the heart circulation of the embryo.
average, like your average mile, your calories are
Good.
and then your total.
Oh, is that, yeah. Wow. That's exactly what I had. Like, yeah.
It's kind of
Verbatim.
like, if you're running, cycling, walking, has all this activity.
The fact that they put commercials in it.
Yeah.
It's just sad. I remember back in the day, it was like,
Even just swimming.
Yeah, I use it.
And then you can hook up a playlist and get them engage your iPod. So you can have playlists that you have things for.
Both, goes into both ventricles at
And
the
then it
same
also
time.
comes like coaching.
And it's filling, you can see it filling up in the atrium because those valves are closed. It's hard to see on this one that the valves are actually opening.
I'm sure that they have like
So,
water.
I get the
we can find
premise. I
another one.
get the premise entirely.
So we're gonna find some shows valve.
Oh, that's way better. Granted, they don't show the blood, they show specifically.
Show the valves.
Yeah.
Right?
It's,
Oh, it's not half bad.
yeah, I was gonna say that, I like that one a lot. That's a really good representation. The arrows pick up.
There you go.
That was the last part that I understood, was the influx at the top of the left atrium.
Atrium.
Yeah, that was the part that put this whole, everything together.
Good.
Yeah. So, thank you for showing me that.
Sure. I'll copy this. You're welcome.
What was our return time, please?
Quarter out?
Yeah. At least I get something this year, maybe. Yeah. I was really sad you got like one of those DiGiorno pizzas. And that was it. That was our Valentine's Day. A little bit of wine.
Oh, that's gonna be our first.
Oh, so you guys are barely new.
She never responds to like my stuff. She's like, man, I really get on these social media.
Maybe I'll
used to study.
Yeah, pretty stressful.
We used to be like getting some studies on
A's on there. You should start making reservations now.
That's where I wanted to stay in. I don't want to say that I wasted years, but I'm like, how the heck did I get all that stuff? And then I can't like, it was fill in the blank. You either knew it or you didn't. I still have my notes like tracing the heart or the blood through the heart and stuff. Should be. I pulled it out. That from the other biology class. 150 ounces taken out.
And so early.
I'm gonna say, now that you're in 431.
When's this one over?
You know, with all the high pressure students trying to add, I've tried to get it
Can
so
I put it all in here because
give preference to people that class like that, or we're trying to move, we have so much in 430, because I expanded my autonomic nervous system, like I said, 2 days to 4 days. And we've talked about taking another class that's cell and pathology, the anatomical terminology of chemistry and cell, and moving that into another class that includes how to study for A&P. And yeah, and it's really difficult to get additional prereqs. And there's always, we've added classes, and we need more classes for them to take. But if we could do it so the students who took that class got priority for registration, and then we kind of encourage them to do that and increase their success, you know, in bio-430 as well. We just say, well, take the class first, and they're like, well, I don't need it every time, I just need to get through it out. And they end up taking it 2 or 3 times, because they're not ready for it. Yes, ma'am.
way more.
The previous one I should use.
But I still have a record, still have a copy.
You know, there's a book for English as well. But I knew you were really good.
Okay, for my own amount of time, I'll pull it up, okay? I'm just gonna let that
Like less than 5 hours.
I know, and then like lab.
Okay, let's come back to class. Jonathan asked me to look for a video that shows how the heart pumps blood, so we found this one after trying a couple. And, well, so kind of rotate through, the colors match our colors, and you can see the valves. So pay attention, here's the pulmonary semilunar valve. And so both atria and ventricles, I'll go through it one more time when this is done. Both atria will contract together, and then they'll relax while the ventricles contract. And that's what we'll talk about on Thursday next week, is the cardiac cycle. So I've posted this as an announcement on D2L. Put the title as well as the URL in case I made a mistake on that. You can just look it up by title. You can see that.
Pretty much happening at the same time.
Yeah, the two, so you have the heart, let's look at it one more time. You have the heart at rest, and while it's at rest, under pressure, blood is flowing into the atria. Both the ventricles are open and blood continues to flow through the atria into the ventricles. Then the two atria will contract and relax, and then the two ventricles will contract and relax, and then both components of the heart can relax. All right, so your cycle is atrial, ventricle, heart at rest. Atria, ventricle, heart at rest. And that's called the cardiac cycle that we'll cover on Thursday. On your lecture notes, taking a single drop of blood through one chamber at a time, you go right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, left lung, pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. So it doesn't contract in that sequence. That's just following one single red blood cell. So one more time. You can see the two atria contracting. Both atrioventricular valves are open. They actually stay open for a longer. This is pretty rapid heart rate. So at a slower heart rate, they're going to stay open while this portion of the heart fills with blood. Okay. So the valves aren't opening on their own. It's the pressure that's pushing them open. Okay. And that's essential to understand next Thursday's lecture as we go through the sequences. It's no new information. It's just what's happening when. And it's something you can figure out. Okay? So it's the ventricle contracting that's pushing blood and opening up the semilunar valves. All right. So now let's look at coronary circulation, and as I said, that will be a bit shorter. Just wanted to make sure you remembered it so we'll give you a chance to stretch. So, as we indicated, there are two vessels. The first branches of the aorta are these two small vessels down here, rather than the three large vessels that everybody talks about up here. Okay? So I've even heard faculty say the first three branches of the aorta are, and they forget about the two arteries down here. Okay, that are going, the heart gets first dibs at oxygenated blood. So the vessels to identify are two coronary arteries, and each of those two coronary arteries have two branches that I want you to know. Okay, there's multiple other branches, but we have a left and a right coronary artery, and each coronary artery has two branches. And then we have three veins that I want you to be able to identify that are returning blood to the heart. So we'll look at this diagram first. And we have the aorta. And coming out of the aorta is the right coronary artery. It's going to travel in what's known as the coronary sulcus. That is this groove between the atrium and the ventricle. Okay, so it's the groove right here between the atrium and the ventricle. And you can see the right coronary artery right here, traveling out of the aorta and around to the right side. So it's going to travel in that sulcus, in that groove. And then it's going to curve around and become posterior. So the dotted line means posterior, okay? The first branch of the right coronary artery runs along the inferior border of the heart. Again, A is my symbol for abbreviation for artery. So this first branch runs along the inferior border of the heart and is known as the marginal artery. Now the heart has several marginal arteries, but this is the only one that you have to learn. The right coronary artery goes all the way around here in the coronary sulcus, all right? And it ends, it gives off a terminal branch that's going to travel down the posterior wall of the heart between the left and right ventricles, what we call the interventricular sulcus, the groove between the two ventricles. So because it's posterior, I'm also going to draw that in a dotted line. And that is the posterior interventricular artery. So we have two branches, marginal and posterior interventricular. So that's the right side. Here's the marginal, here's the posterior interventricular.
What's the name of the posterior sulcus?
Pardon?
What is the name of the posterior sulcus?
Same thing, interventricular sulcus. So if we look on this diagram, here's the aorta. This would be the pulmonary trunk, which is on the anterior surface of the heart, and the aorta is coming out the middle of the heart as it comes from the left side. Here would be the right coronary artery, and here's the marginal artery. All right, on the heart models, you can find the marginal artery because traveling with it is a vein that comes up in this direction and makes a right angle turn to travel with the right coronary artery. The other veins go directly into the right atrium, so that's the only one that makes that right angle bend and continues around the posterior aspect. The left coronary artery is very difficult to see on your models because it's short. It branches almost immediately. Plus, it comes off the aorta behind or just posterior to the pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary trunk is going to cover it up. All right. So you'll see, if you see it, you'll see just a small section. It's only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long before it actually divides. So on the left side, we have the left coronary artery. And it also has two major branches that are the ones that I want you to identify. One is going to travel down the front of the heart in the interventricular groove on the front of the heart. And that is known, not surprisingly, as the anterior interventricular artery. Obviously, everything has multiple names. I'm not going to even write this next one up. But if you work in a hospital section and you look at angiograms, these are known as the anterior descending artery or the posterior. And so you'll see different names. You're like, wait a minute, I don't recognize any of this. And that's because they're just using a different set of terminology that seems reserved for clinical use because anatomically, these are the terms that we use. So this is going to be identified as the left. Oh, let's see, where do I want to put this? Anyway, I'm going to put that. Sorry. Left. I didn't think right. Anterior. Okay. So anterior. Interventricular artery. And then the second branch is really the equivalent or homologous structure to our right coronary artery. Because on the right side, it belts around between the atrium and the ventricle. And on the left side, the left coronary artery isn't doing that, it's too short. It's the circumflex. So to circumvent something means to go around it, okay, or to circumscribe. So this vessel And we'll draw a dotted line. And it tapers off, but forms a branch that you don't need to know. And this is the circumflex artery. So before we do the veins, let's make sure you guys can see them on your hearts. All right? So here would be the anterior interventricular artery coming down the front and going around the left side in the groove between the atrium and the ventricle. And we can see it on the back. Coming around here partially before it kind of breaks up. And Netters has like a page of 8 or 10 different variations, but these would be the most common variation. Would be the circumflex artery. Okay? So make sure everybody can see those on your hearts, and then we'll put the veins in with them. Well, we have just 3 veins. So obviously one vein is going to be found with more than one artery. Anybody have trouble finding the right or left coronary arteries? If you do, just go back to the aorta. And the right's going to go all the way around to the back before it gives off a terminal branch. And the left will give off the circumflex, which does the same thing. Okay? Now, these arteries, as you can see, are giving off multiple branches. These are just the major ones. And interestingly enough, unlike